What's up? We're back with another Balance Druid guide video. This time we're going to be talking about War Within Moonkin. So for a lot of the changes that are going into the War Within, the major system update is going to be to hero talents. The talent system just as a whole is staying very similar to what we saw in Dragonflight. And so the main cornerstone system that we're going to be seeing is going to be hero talents for Balance Druid. We're going to be covering basically everything that you've seen from the changes from Dragonflight to the War Within, hero talents, talent builds, rotation, and then some like gear, embellishment, stats, what you need to know about the tier sets as well. I think I forgot to put that in my notes, but I'll have to bring those up as well. Knowing about like the tier set and stuff like that, and how that all ends up affecting Moonkin's gameplay. So this is built to be an all-encompassing guide video where it's going to kind of, if you've already played Moonkin, there's going to be some level of knowledge retention where we're talking about the changes from Dragonflight to now. If you've never played Moonkin as well, particularly with like the rotation section and like the talent builds and stuff like that, we're going to kind of walk you through how to be able to play the spec. Ultimately, video guides get outdated very quickly, so if you're looking for something that's a lot more eternal or long-standing, you should probably check out like the Wowhead guide. That's going to be updated by me. Alternatively, if you don't want to do that, you can check out the Dreamgrove compendium, also a very well-maintained guide. So those are the two ones that I would definitely recommend checking out if you're looking for something that's written, if you're watching this a few months into the future. But in general, it should still give you pretty good advice as to like how the spec is going to be playing and like what you're going to be looking at, and also like just more broad strokes. But in terms of like what talent build we're playing for that patch, that might change from patch to patch or season to season, or even like with some class tuning. I also kind of expect Moonkin to get some class tuning over the next couple of weeks. Whether or not that's going to change our rotation, whether or not that's going to change what hero talents we're playing, that's really going to be up in the air. And that's also kind of one of those things that while this is going to be a good starting point, it's not going to be an eternal video, which is unfortunate. Okay, let's start off by talking about the changes from Dragonflight to War Within. First and foremost, there have been some talent tree changes. There's been changes in the class tree. Pulsar has been removed, and Celestial Alignment / Incarnation is on a shorter duration. So this is going to be a section that pre-existing players are going to be able to understand what's actually going on with balance going into the War Within. First and foremost, let's start off by the removal of Primordial Arcanic Pulsar. So Pulsar was the choice node on Orbital Strike here in the spec tree, and it was probably the main gameplay altering talent for the last couple of expansions for balance. Whenever you would build Astral Power, you would get a free proc of Incarnation or Celestial Alignment for 8 to 12 seconds. I think it was 12 seconds. And it was very good. It was very strong. Blizzard decided that it was an undeniably powerful effect, but the cadence made some talents really weird. It also ended up constraining Balance's design. It ended up getting removed. We basically then got some talents that tried to replace the impact level of Pulsar. First off, on the choice node where Pulsar was, now they have a node called Greater Alignment, which states that your Incarn lasts 40% longer, and you also get minor Eclipse damage bonus effects. Additionally, there's a couple of new nodes with Stellar Amplification, which Star Surge increases the damage the target takes from your periodic effects and shooting stars by 20% for 5 seconds. Additionally, there's Touch of the Cosmos, which will be casting Wrath or Starfire, will give you a free Star Surge or Starfall proc. It does get consumed by some effects like Convoke and whatnot, so it's unclear as to like how good it'll end up being, but that is also a new node that we have. Additionally, we also have Harmony of the Heavens, which is the Amir Drasil 4 set, where Star Surge or Starfall will increase your Eclipse's damage bonus. But beyond that, that's mostly it for nodes that we've had changed just as a whole. Now, the class tree also got an update, and I would describe this for returning players as more or less the same class tree that you had in the past, where you're going to struggle to put points into everything that you're wanting to. This comes down to more or less the fact that talenting into things like Iron Fur, Instincts of the Claw, Soothe whenever you don't need it, Rejuvenation whenever you don't need it, is just going to end up being cumbersome. And so taking things like Remove Corruption is going to be a bit hard. There's going to be a lot of instances where it's going to be difficult to path into Nature's Vigil or Innervate. We do have a couple of new nodes. The only notable one is we have Oak Skin, which will actually increase the DR of your bark skin by an additional 10%. It's something we absolutely needed. Additionally, we also got 10% bonus HP whenever we go into bear form, which I guess is a thing, but those are more or less the only things that you need to know about what's changing with the generic class tree. Circling back to the balance-specific talents, not a lot is changing necessarily with the balance-specific talents. Yeah, I talked about those couple of new nodes. But if you noticed, a lot of them are passive. So very few of them are going to be gameplay altering in terms of how you're playing the specialization. And what I would say is if you play Dragonflight Moonkin, War Within Moonkin is going to feel very similar. Particularly if you were playing like the later seasons where they cut down on a lot of the rotational complexity, that's going to continue to maintain, where there are very few buffs that you're going to be looking to track. There are very few dots that you're going to have to track. It's more or less you're going to be pressing your builder and your spender, and there's not too much else to it beyond that. Even things like Star-Lord and Star-Lord canceling is no longer a thing, and so you don't really have to track both. There's like a lot of stuff that's really simplified down the spec and how it plays just as a whole. So let's talk about the major system that we have in the War Within, which are hero talents. We have 2 hero talents, Keeper of the Grove and Elune's Chosen. I'm going to start off by talking about Keeper of the Grove. Keeper of the Grove is a treant-based, Force of Nature treant-based hero talent build, where whenever you cast your Force of Nature treants, you get a damage buff, or you get a buff that's on your player. It's called Dream Burst. And whenever you cast Wrath or Starfire on the mobs, they have like this slight puff of smoke that's going to do some AoE that is surrounding the mobs. Additionally, there's other nodes that are in the Keeper of the Grove hero tree, but the primary one in the capstone node is Harmony of the Grove. For each Force of Nature treant that you have, it will increase the damage of your spells and abilities by 8% while active. This is upwards of 24% for each treant that you have available to you, and so you're heavily incentivized to press these on CD. Then the treants will also do a couple of minor effects, like the Force of Nature treants will cast Moonfire on nearby targets every 8 seconds. There's also Force of Nature cooldown that's in the tree. And that's more or less all of the gameplay altering stuff. Now, every hero talent tree has a defensive node, and for Keeper of the Grove, it's actually a pretty powerful defensive node. It's called Protective Growth, and your regrowth protects you, reducing your damage that you take by 8% while regrowth is on you. Balance Druid, not necessarily known for being the most durable specialization, and so this is actually a pretty good defensive node. Let's talk about some of the choice nodes, because you might notice that there are a lot of choice nodes in both of the hero talent trees. For Keeper of the Grove, you have Power of Nature and Durability of Nature. For damage, Power of Nature is always going to be better. Basically, it makes your trees no longer taunt, which will increase their survivability as a whole, allowing you to maintain that 24% damage gain. The other one is Durability of Nature, which is your Force of Nature treants have 50% increased HP. I've played around with this in Mythic Plus a little bit on the beta, and ultimately your trees are still going to be dying, and this is not necessarily something that you can afford to have happen. If you're going to play trees for the taunt effect, you're probably going to end up having to play like an Elune's Chosen build, because taking a damage penalty, losing the Harmony of the Grove, 24% damage bonus whenever the treants get killed off is not very valuable. For Grove Inspiration versus Potent Enchantments, Grove Inspiration has been semming higher for most of the beta. Wrath and Starfire damage, your builders have been doing a considerable amount of damage, and so just being able to amp that up is a bit better than Orbital Strike having Stellar Flare for additional 8 seconds, or Greater Alignment having additional Eclipse damage modifiers. Early Spring versus Botanist Bloom. So Early Spring is generally seen as a lot better. So 15 seconds of duration off of the cooldown on Force of Nature. You know, again, we're really fishing for this 24% damage gain for Harmony of the Grove. That's the reason that this ends up being better than generating 10 Astral Power every 2 seconds. Ultimately, this just isn't a ton of Astral Power generation either from the Bloom, so you don't end up talenting that too much. You know, this could change in the future, but it's not something that's necessary. Additionally, every single time your Treants of the Moon cast that Moonfire, you do get some Astral Power from that, and so there is a decent amount of Astral Power that's generated just whenever you have your treants available from you for Keeper of the Grove. Power of the Dream versus Control the Dream is probably the most interesting choice node on our entire tree. Power of the Dream is generally seen as a little bit better damage-wise, where Force of Nature will grant you additional stacks of Dream Burst. Dream Burst damage is not anything to necessarily scoff at. They've had to nerf it a couple of times progressively over the course of the beta cycle. Power of the Dream is still the preferred choice node, whereas Control the Dream will be time elapsed while your major cooldown abilities are available to be used as subtracted from that ability's cooldown after the next time you use it up to 15 seconds. It will affect things like Force of Nature, Celestial Alignment, and Convoke. So we've simmed this a little bit, and it still seems like it's like a percent to 1.5% behind. There's weird timings that might make Control the Dream better in some instances. Not any that we've necessarily seen in Sims yet, but it's such a weird and unique talent that there are maybe some spots that Control the Dream could be potentially better than Power of the Dream. However, what I would say is you should be talenting Power of the Dream in almost all circumstances, unless Sims or some other reason have cooked up a reason that you would take Control the Dream instead. Moving over to the other hero talent tree, we have Elune's Chosen. So Elune's Chosen is a more astral themed tree where the main abilities are based around Full Moon and Fury of Elune. So you have this thing at the very top. It's called Balance Moonlight, and basically whenever your Fury of Elune expires, it will proc the Balance Moonlight, which will do AoE damage in like a burst whenever the Fury of Elune expires. Whereas for Full Moon, basically Full Moon will call down a bunch of minor moons whenever you press it that do damage to the surrounding targets. Additionally, they generate a small amount more astral power whenever the minor moons contact the target. The big thing is also the Eternal Moon, the capstone node, where the Flash of Energy now generates 6 astral power and its damage is increased by 50% for Fury of Elune, which is an incredibly powerful AoE effect. And for Full Moon, New Moon and Half Moon will also call down minor moons, which will increase your astral power generation. I will say at current time of recording this, Fury of Elune is by far the best Elune's Chosen point that you can take. There is basically no situation where you would take Full Moon in this node. And a lot of this comes down to one of the choice nodes in Lunation. Lunation reads your arcane abilities reduce the cooldown of Fury of Elune by 2 seconds and the cooldown of New Moon, Half Moon, and Full Moon by 1 second. The cooldown reduction for Lunation is really easy to feed into itself. It also procs off of your spenders because those do astral damage, which is both arcane and solar. So Lunation is a very powerful node, and then just having things like Sundered Firmament that procs from every other eclipse. You also have the Light of Elune, which can proc more Fury of Elunes, and so this actually creates quite an interesting Mythic Plus build in terms of where you're getting your damage contribution from, proccing this Boundless Moonlight over and over again, proccing this Boundless Moonlight on AoE, and Elune's Chosen is generally structured to be a more AoE-centric tree for balance, just as a whole. Looking at the rest of the nodes, the Glistening Fur is the DR node that we have in the tree. And I'm going to be straight up, this node is trash, especially compared to the Protective Growth node that we saw in the last tree. Bear Form and Moonkin Form reduce arcane damage by 6%, and all other magic damage taken by 3%. Probably one of the weakest defensive nodes in any hero class. Yeah, I guess. Looking at some of the other nodes, most of these are pretty passive, just damage gain effects, where things like Moonfire deal a 20% additional damage. Enemies damaged by Full Moon or Fury of Elune will take 6% increased damage from you for 6 seconds. Not a lot of these have gameplay-altering effects. Now, that's not necessarily true for some of the choice nodes. First off, we have Stellar Command versus Lunar Calling. Stellar Command will increase the damage of your Fury of Elune by 15% and the damage of your Full Moon by 25%. And you heard me earlier kind of talking and hyping up how strong Fury of Elune was and how much damage it was doing. A lot of the Fury of Elune damage is, funnily enough, baked into Boundless Moonlight, and it's not necessarily baked into the Fury of Elune itself. However, the big node that's very strong for Elune's Chosen, because frankly it's just overtuned right now, is Lunar Calling. Starfire will deal 65% increased damage to its primary target, but no longer trigger Solar Eclipse, meaning that you have to stay in permanent Lunar Eclipse and you're starfiring on single target, and you're starfiring on AoE in all situations. Lunar Calling is an incredibly powerful node, as are Starfire damage and things like some of the modifiers like Umbral Intensity, Umbral Embrace, Umbral Inspiration. These nodes are all increasing our Starfire damage just as a whole. We also are talenting things like Warrior of Elune for Mythic Plus to be able to get even more Starfire damage. And Starfire is something that is actually incredibly strong. If you go and look at some sims for Mythic Plus right now, you'll see that Starfire is about 26% of our damage in total in these sims. And so Lunar Calling is a main contributor to that. It definitely helps you do a lot more damage with your builders just as a whole. The other choice node, I don't think that there's any choice between Arcane Affinity and Lunation. You should always be talenting Lunation. The other choice node that you might have a question about is Light of Elune versus Astral Insight. Light of Elune is whenever you have Moonfires on your target, it has a chance to proc a Fury of Elune that has reduced effectiveness. Again, the Fury of Elune and the astral power generated from that Fury of Elune, not the most important thing. The bigger deal is the Boundless Moonlight proc. Again, just the Boundless Moonlight proc, proccing that on AoE, that's going to be contributing and continuing to drive a lot of your AoE damage. On top of that, the other node is Astral Insight, where its Incarnation Chosen of Elune increases your arcane damage from spells and abilities by 10% while active. It will also increase the duration and number of spells cast by Convoke the Spirits by 25%. I could see a world where this ends up being better with Convoke as the patch goes on, or maybe the expansion goes on, maybe some tuning changes. But at current time of recording this, the Light of Elune is just generically going to be a stronger node just as a whole. That kind of wraps up the gameplay differences between both of these hero talents. What I would say, just for people to know, is that Keeper of the Grove is generally seen as a more single target focused tree, where Elune's Chosen is generally seen as a more AoE focused tree. Elune's Chosen having a lot of damage in things like Starfire and Fury of Elune just innately makes it better at doing AoE damage. Whenever you look at Keeper of the Grove requires you to talent Force of Nature, which is inherently going to be taking a point from later on in the tree, especially if you have like Starfall and Ethereal Kindling talented. So that's going to be a little bit weird for making it a better, more well-rounded Mythic Plus build just as a whole. So Keeper of the Grove is generally seen as a more single target focused build, where you're able to amp up things like Convoke the Spirits with your trees. Like you drop your trees, and then you press your CA, and then you convoke into it, and you're kind of stacking these percentage damage modifiers and just trying to go back to that Shadowland Season 1 playstyle where you're really just like trying to amp up these big convokes on single target as strong as possible. Let's talk about our rotation a little bit before we talk about some of the talent builds. The thing that you need to know about the rotation is that we play on a priority list. Some specs play on like very strict rotation, like you have to press this button during this cooldown, otherwise this proc is not going to happen, or you need to really make sure that you're getting your heating up procs at this exact time so you can press your pirates and stuff like that. Moonkin's not that way. Moonkin is a lot more free-form with when you're going to be pressing your buttons just generally, and if you end up following a generalized priority list and you follow it to the T, you're going to be successful. The cornerstones and like the key points of this priority list are avoiding capping Astral Power by pressing your spender abilities like Star Surge and Starfall. So Starfall is generally seen as the AoE spender, while Star Surge is the single target spender. Capping Astral Power is generally a massive damage loss, especially whenever you're playing with things like Lunation, like was mentioned in the hero talent tree earlier. You're just like missing globals that otherwise would happen, and you're wasting a resource. That's unacceptable, just generally speaking. So avoiding capping Astral Power is like the top of that priority list. Next is like dotting the mobs. So Mastery is a very important stat for Balance Druid, and what the Mastery does for Moonkin is that whenever the targets have your Sunfire or your Moonfire on them, they take bonus damage from all of your abilities. And so obviously you're going to be heavily incentivized, even in like situations like Mythic Plus, to be able to have dots on every single target at any given moment. This will then increase the damage that you're doing to every single mob. Generally is seen that like whenever you're starting to pull a pack, you're going to be dotting the mobs as like your first global before you press your cooldowns, before you press literally anything else. Assuming that you're not capping Astral Power, dotting the mobs is honestly like an insanely important thing. Another pretty heavy priority is using your cooldowns on CD. A lot of people, for whatever reason, especially whenever you're a newer player, end up holding your CDs a lot. This will actually also happen with like minor cooldowns like Force of Nature, Treants, Fury of Elune, and Full Moon. Holding your CDs for any extended period of time is going to make you lose an exceptionally large point of damage, especially with talents like Lunation, which you're getting passive CDR from your build just as a whole. If you end up holding your CDs and you don't send them on cooldown, that's going to mess up your priority rotation. You should be pressing these like rather quickly. The last part of this priority is like Eclipse uptime and pressing your builders. Basically, Balance has a secondary resource, which is called Eclipse. And there's two types of eclipses. There's Solar Eclipse and Lunar Eclipse. Lunar Eclipse is the one that corresponds with like Starfire and Arcane damage. And Solar Eclipse is the solar one that corresponds with like Wrath damage. Typically, it's seen as Wrath and Solar Eclipse are the more single target focused eclipse, where Starfire and Lunar Eclipse are seen as the more AoE focused eclipse. Obviously, something like Lunar Calling is going to change your eclipse uptime, but your eclipse lasts for 15 seconds. You have to come out of an eclipse and then you cast the opposite corresponding builder to go into the other eclipse. So basically you would cast 2 Starfires to go into Solar Eclipse, and you would cast 2 Wraths to go into Lunar Eclipse, for example. Having 100% uptime or as close to 100% uptime on your eclipses is actually very important. And having good eclipse management, while it's not the most important thing, it is something that's still relevant, and making mistakes with your eclipse, especially whenever it's so easy to deal with correctly, is generally seen as unacceptable. So for other rotational stuff that you need to know about, there's not a ton beyond that general priority rotation. And of course, you can check out things like the Wowhead rotation guide. You can check out the Dreamgrove Compendium rotation guide to kind of look at what's actually going on, especially whenever you have specific talents selected. So there's a couple of things that you probably need to know, particularly that pertain to the hero talents. First off, it's probably when to press your Fury of Elune, and secondly, it's when to press your trees. There's also a little bit of a question as to when you're supposed to press your Convoke and how you're supposed to use that as well. But in terms of like trees and Fury of Elune, I think that those two are probably the most important things. So for trees, you actually want to press your Force of Nature Treants prior to pressing your Incarnation. This, especially whenever you're playing with something like Orbital Strike, which does a little bit of damage whenever you press your Celestial Alignment and uses like a targeting reticle to shoot this beam across the world. Pressing this prior to pressing your Celestial Alignment and prior to pressing your Convoke is actually seen as a pretty good damage gain. On top of that, if God forbid you're playing a Keeper of the Grove build in Mythic Plus, pressing the trees prior to you pressing your CDs and prior to, honestly, you dotting the mobs in some instances is actually going to be seen as preferred. That's when you're supposed to be pressing your trees. For Fury of Elune, this is a massive damage loss if you don't do this on AoE, but it's also like a 0.5% loss if you don't do it on single target. You have to press your Fury of Elune prior to pressing your Incarnation. On AoE, it is like a 2.5% damage loss if you don't press your Fury of Elune prior to pressing your CDs. So it's one of those things that you need to be getting more Starfires into your CA window. And so this Fury of Elune is like a pretty big deal as to when you're supposed to be pressing it. The last thing that might not be super intuitive is when you're supposed to be pressing Convoke the Spirits and how you're supposed to be pressing Convoke the Spirits. Particularly whenever you have things like Incarnation and Orbital Strike and stuff like that, you can actually cap yourself on Astral Power whenever the Stellar Flare from the Orbital Strike contacts targets. Whenever that happens, you actually want to spend down all of your Astral Power prior to pressing your Convoke. So basically you'll end up pressing like the Treants, then you'll end up pressing the Incarnation, then you'll spend your Astral Power on Star Surge on single target, and then you'll use that Convoke the Spirits to then build yourself back up with Astral Power. Basically every single time Convoke casts Wrath or any of the Druid flavored abilities, you can actually generate a decent amount of Astral Power. And so you don't really want to cap Astral Power in this way. So spending all of your AP prior to Convoking is important. In the past, we haven't necessarily had to worry about this. You would only have to be at like 30 or 40 Astral Power before pressing your Convoke. Now this is no longer the case. You can actually generate a ton of Astral Power. Additionally, from like the Keeper of the Grove tree, you'll generate it passively from your trees like Moonfiring and stuff like that. So you really want to spend down all of this AP before pressing your Convoke. Yeah, so beyond that, there's not necessarily too much to know about the Balance Druid rotation. Just want to reiterate again, make sure that you're dotting all the targets with your Moonfire and Sunfire, refreshing these abilities within the Pandemic window, which is 30% of the base duration of the dot, is actually very important. Making sure that you are spending your Astral Power, not capping your Astral Power, also incredibly important. And then just kind of using your cooldowns on CD. That's going to be more important with like the hero talent management and stuff like that. So really making sure that you have good tracking for both Treants and Fury of Elune, particularly for Season 1. Those are going to be very important things to be looking at any given moment, making sure that you're not wasting any seconds of those being off cooldown. Any second that's wasted of those being off cooldown is going to be a pretty big damage loss in the grand scheme of things. Now that we've covered the rotation, let's kind of talk about some of the talent builds and what things are going to be looking like. Additionally, if you want, go check out the compendium, go check out the Wowhead guide. If you go look at the Wowhead page and you look at all the Druid talents, you can actually see a list of a bunch of different talents in different situations at which different builds will be used. But I'm going to cover probably the two most important builds, a single target build for Raid, and then just like a generically strong Mythic Plus build. And I'm going to kind of talk about some of the key points and key takeaways of things that I've seen from Mythic Plus builds and just builds in general. First and foremost, with the Mythic Plus build, it's going to be an Elune's Chosen Lunar Calling based build. Elune's Chosen Lunar Calling builds are incredibly important. Basically, all of your damage is going to be in Fury of Elune. We don't talent like anything at the end of the tree. Funnily enough, nodes like Warrior of Elune are incredibly strong for just increasing your Starfire damage. We were looking at that earlier in Sims, and Starfire damage is like such a main generator of your damage on AoE, and Warrior of Elune is, of course, very strong at that. Lunar Shrapnel is, funnily enough, not talented. It's actually dropped for something like Stellar Amplification, which gives you a little bit more periodic effect damage. You're only Star Surging still on single target, where you're Star Falling on AoE. And so there's not too much really to say about this talent build in general. Just continuing to follow your priority. What I will give you as a tip for this build is making sure that you rip your Fury of Elunes as often as possible. Again, making sure that you press your Fury of Elune before your Orbital Strike is super important. You do a lot of AoE damage in your Celestial Alignment window, and so Celestial Alignment in the past wasn't necessarily super strong or super bursty. But that's no longer necessarily the case for Mythic Plus. Making sure that you have like really strong on-pull CAs with this Orbital Strike is gonna make for a better use case. What I will say for Mythic Plus as well is you're gonna have to figure out a way to get Remove Corruption often. I will say that I've been dropping things like Nature's Vigil and Innervate a lot to be able to get down to this Remove Corruption point. Additionally, if you think that you don't need something like Incapacitating Roar, you could drop that. If you don't think that you need something like Verdant Heart, you could drop that as well. So say you don't want Verdant Heart and you don't want Incap Roar, you can still talent Nature's Vigil. Nature's Vigil is a very strong effect. But this ultimately kind of comes down to what you think about the dungeon and where you're going. What I would say is 4 of the dungeons have heavily incentivized decurse or poison dispels in them. 2 of the dungeons it's very nice in, and 2 of the dungeons it's not required in. So playing with the decurse and the dispel as just like a default build is probably going to be more preferred for the average player, just as a general rule. So I'm actually going to talk about raid, but I'm actually going to talk about a pure single target build for raid, and then there's going to be a raid build that has a little bit of cleave that's like an Elune's Chosen base build. So the Keeper of the Grove build is by far the most preferred build for single target. It does a lot more single target damage based around things like Denizens of the Dream, Convoke the Spirits. Obviously, you have your Force of Nature treants in this build. You obviously don't want to talent things like Soul Force, where that's going to be obviously, for whatever reason, it's just not a damage gain. I simmed it, and it was a damage loss for God knows what reason. So a lot of this damage that you're going to be doing via Keeper of the Grove is actually going to be baked into Convoke the Spirits. You're going to see like your largest amount of damage burst whenever you're pressing this Convoke. Again, the class tree a bit precarious as to what you're supposed to get. Does Nature's Vigil really matter in raid? Probably not. Maybe Incapacitating Roar doesn't matter in raid, so you can get that Vigil instead. That'll maybe help you out a little bit. But in general, this is going to be looking to be more or less the build that you're going to be playing for raid. Now, there's a couple of other balanced builds that you can play for raid. I made this Elune's Chosen build, so there's a couple of fights like, gosh, what's his name? Roshanon, maybe? And Brood Twister and Silken Court that have some amount of cleave and some amount of AoE. There's going to be some level of these fights that you actually do want Starfall for, so that in that case, you'd probably be looking to run the more conventional Mythic Plus level build. But for fights that actually Starfall isn't really good for, like Brood Twister and stuff like that, you're going to end up just playing like Soul of the Forest. You're going to be still playing Convoke, where the boss damage is actually going to matter a decent amount. And then you're just going to be like Starfiring and Fury of Eluding all of the pad adds. That's going to contribute most, again, because most of your AoE damage is actually coming from Starfire and Boundless Moonlight anyways, that talenting Starfall isn't always the optimal thing for raid. And so then there's going to be a question as to what you're supposed to play on a couple of different fights, where you're supposed to be playing that Elune's Chosen versus that Keeper of the Grove build. But I think that like some of the later fights, you're definitely going to be playing this like Elune's Chosen, like semi-hybrid AoE build, but you're not going to be talenting into Starfall. I do think that you're going to be talenting into Starfall and like fight like Silken Court, which has spread AoE. Obviously, for any spread AoE mechanic or in any spread AoE fight where mobs aren't going to get like insta-killed by your Fury Warrior or something like that, or your Frost DK, having that Starfall is still very valuable. Any like really long form sustained AoE fight in raid also going to be pretty good. Next up, let's talk about gear, embellishments, and stats. So what I will say is stats have changed a bit. So in the past, Balance Druid for a very long time has been mastery haste stacking, where you're heavy mastery. Now on primary single target fights, like I was saying earlier, Convoke is a larger portion of your damage. And whenever Convoke is a larger portion of your damage on single target, this really devalues haste, just as a general rule. So then you see stat weights change on both Keeper of the Grove and Elune's Chosen single target builds, where it's going to value mastery and versatility as your top 2 stats for pure single target. Again, this kind of comes down to this Convoke build being a little bit better. Now, this isn't like super surprising. We saw this in Shadowlands Season 1, as Convoke was very strong then. The biggest change by far is haste scaling and how haste is good for Mythic Plus on AoE. We are very close to haste and mastery for AoE situations where I've actually seen a lot of sims where haste is actually outstatting and outscaling mastery on AoE. A lot of it comes down to Lunar Calling. Whenever we were looking at this earlier, your ability to be able to press Starfire more frequently is going to increase your haste versus mastery gain a lot. I would heavily recommend simming your character's gear. Be looking at potentially getting a lot more haste-heavy rings, a lot more haste-heavy gems, and potentially some slots for Mythic Plus, if that's something that's going to be good for your character. Because as you can see right here, for secondary stat weights for generalized AoE sim, haste and mastery are very close. So depending on your gear, it could change what's actually good in some instances. Haste also does weird things with like partial ticks of Fury of Elune. And obviously in things like Elune's Chosen, partial ticks for Fury of Elune are just going to be very good, because you're getting a lot of Fury of Elune procs. Next up, we'll talk about embellishments a little bit. I unfortunately don't have any graphics or anything to show off for embellishments, because embellishments aren't implemented yet in Simulation Craft. They're also not fully implemented in game, and there's a lot of weird bugs with embellishments where they're basically not scaling with item level at all. It seems like the embellishments aren't fully implemented in any meaningful capacity, where this is actually pretty bad for the embellishments. A lot of the embellishments look really bad because of this. I kind of suspect that they're going to change them to be more similar and more in line to what we saw with like some of the Dragonflight embellishments, but that hasn't happened yet. Additionally, embellishments aren't implemented in Simulation Craft, so it's very difficult to see like what's the difference between some of the embellishments. There are a couple of embellishments that are implemented in SimC, such as like focusing lens and stuff like that, but like I don't think that embellishment's going to be necessarily good. From what I've seen, it's like not that great, but it's not terrible. At the same point, what I will tell you about embellishments is that their damage contribution amount has gone down a lot since Dragonflight. Embellishments are basically making up less than 1% of your damage. It is like a trivial amount. And I've seen some embellishments that are so severely undertuned that actually taking the 3 item levels on a piece of gear, going from 636 to 639 instead of wearing that embellishment, is actually a damage increase, which is obviously a joke. I think that there's a high degree of likelihood that embellishments end up getting changed in some capacity. I don't have sims for embellishments, so I would go look at a written guide after time of recording this to see what's actually changed with the embellishments, especially if you're looking to craft something like 2 weeks into the season. You don't need to craft something like the first couple of weeks. Embellishments are completely irrelevant. Don't craft anything the first couple of weeks. That's just my general advice. As for Trinket Sims, seems like Arakara, Sackbrood, and Spymaster's Web have been universally the top trinkets for balance in both AoE and single target situations so far. I think that there are a lot of very, very bad trinkets. Similar to embellishments, all of the trinkets are at least implemented in Simulation Craft. However, a lot of the trinkets are massively undertuned in some aspects where they are huge damage downs to where you end up don't playing them. But as it currently stands, it looks like Arakara, Sackbrood, and Spymaster's Web end up being very solid. I would be looking at other things like the Grim Batol trinket's not terrible. Changeling is also not horrible. But this is all subject to change due to tuning of trinkets. Moonkin is actually looking for like a pretty decent on-use trinket. And Spymaster's Web is a more modular design for on-use trinkets, where you're actually able to press this at any time, with Orbital Strike and with a lot of your damage being contributed like Fury of Elune and on-use effects like Force of Nature and stuff like that. Cooldown stacking is a lot more powerful for Balance Druid than it has been in the past, because more often than not, we've been a sustained damage spec. Now we have a decent bit more burst, and a strong on-use trinket like Spymaster's Web is going to fulfill that niche for us. It does come from the raid. If you can't get it from the raid, then maybe looking at other on-use trinkets, like a different trinket from the raid and stuff like that, could be valuable as well. But it's kind of up in the air as to what the best combo is going to be. As it currently stands, it's Sackbrood and Spymaster's Web, though. All right, that's going to be it for the video today. I hope the guide helps. Come check out my stream. I'm going to be streaming a lot on War Within launch. Also, I had to pay to turn my electricity back on, so you guys are funding my electricity by watching this video. So thank you guys all so much for watching the video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Goodbye.